swimming in a richness greater than I was capable of expressing in words at the time. I can remember the epic absorption of a great detective story that I played with these neighborhood boys when we lived in Aurora, so I had to be less than 5 because we moved away when we were 5. But to me, it was an epic battle. And that kind of absorption into imagination is something that I've carried with me as an adult. And in that feeling of absorption and play gives me a deep feeling of fulfillment when I get to use my imagination. And even more, I feel a great excitement when I bring my creativity, when my creativity converges with other people's imagination and we work on a vision together. And I'll say a second about what that meant for me with the Playhouse, but I wanted to give you another taste of Vivian Paley. So if Preston, if you could share that slide with, there's just a short quote. Vivian Gusson Paley, I'll tell you about her, was a writer and a kindergarten teacher, and a MacArthur's Genius Award winner. She wrote 10 books about children and imagination. And what she really, to me, was an anthropologist of play. She was she wasn't so much interested in like the best way to teach as she was in what can we learn from children, because they are sort of in another country and we can learn so much from observing how their minds think. And this gives you a little bit of a little glimpse of her passion. So if you can play that, Chris. If you can make it big too.
Running, crawling, jumping, climbing, bumping, pushing, pulling, and pouncing. These are necessary survival skills. And to these, human children must add another survival skill: imaginative play. They must practice pretending to be someone else in another place, making up character, plot, and dialogue for the story they invent. They are, in truth, inventing abstract thinking. The act of stepping outside oneself and viewing a broader perspective of relationships, verbal, visual, social, physical. But they are also, it seems to me, inventing reading, writing, and arithmetic, all in an earlier, primitive form, in preparation form. They are inventing and reinventing themselves as thinking people before the world tells them what to think. They do this as they literally play around with ideas. In effect, the child says, I am someone with ideas. I am someone who turns ideas into actions, and actions into new ideas. And furthermore, this is what I am intending to do. I am intending to have my own ideas. That's why I play the way I do, to show myself what my ideas are and how necessary I am to the truth.
Okay, you can stop it there. Again, our technology challenges continue today. And you can stop sharing. Or actually, I'm sorry, if you could share the slideshow. So I was talking about what I liked from that quote from Vivian Paley. Not, yeah, could you go to the next slide? Sorry. Yeah. So here's Vivian Paley in 2004. Connie Green worked with the Playhouse we partnered to bring Vivian Paley to ASU. And that's her in the very earliest version of the Playhouse, demonstrating story acting with kids. And the boy in the striped shirt and the blonde hair is our son, Nate. So, okay, and you can go to the next slide. So anyway, just to go, what I see from Roxaboxen is that one, that absorption that children have where their play is bigger than they can express verbally. It's very real and detailed and rich to them. And also it's a way to build community. And so that's what in adulthood and my work with the Children's Playhouse, what has given me my greatest joy is providing opportunities. This is Cardboard City at our annual Build Fest. You can go to the next slide. It's coming up with ideas for exhibits. This is me painting the mushroom sink for our new Enchanted Cottage exhibit. But it's also something that I need to remember to make sure that I always leave space for the kids to bring their own absorbing stories to the play. So I'm now going to invite, you can stop sharing. That's a peek of Craig's, surprise, surprise, it's got some comics in it. But now we're going to hear from Bill, so I'm going to invite Bill to come up.
This was actually a bit of a challenge for me. I usually speak about adult things, careers and curriculum and music, leadership, those sorts of things. Occasionally here at Boone UU, I've addressed spiritual issues, but usually from an adult perspective. So talking about childhood is a really different matter for me. It seemed much less academic as I started, really forced me to think about some of the truths of my life. But I took the challenge and I did a bit of research first to make sure that I had a good working definition of the word imagination. And here's what Oxford says. It's the faculty or action of forming new ideas or images or concepts of external objects not present to the senses, as in, he'd never been blessed with a vivid imagination. Or the ability of the mind to be creative or resourceful, as in, technology and the wonders of outer space gives engineers the chance to use their imagination. Or the part of the mind that imagines things, a girl who existed only in my imagination. I found almost 30 synonyms for imagination: creativity, mind's eye, interest, fascination, attention, passion, curiosity, preoccupation, fancy, vision, inspiration, insight, inventiveness, resourcefulness, initiative, ingenuity, enterprise, originality, innovation, individuality, unorthodoxy, nonconformity, cleverness, wit, genius, flair, panache, and artistry. It's remarkable that the English language has so many words that are about that ability to be in your mind and out of your mind. It's a long list that brings to mind many different ways of navigating the world. If I was imaginative as a child, and I think all children are so, our UU grand mentor, Robert Fulgham, in fact, bemoans the fact that we lose our most vivid and active imagination about the time we're in kindergarten. Well, so how did I manifest my imagination and what were the influences on it? I brainstormed a bit about what I was like and what I did when I was a kid. I lived in 3 states by the time I was 8. I was born in Seattle. We moved to Pullman, Washington when I was 3, then to Corvallis, Oregon for 3 years, and to Juneau, Alaska when I was 8. My father was an oceanographer, so Alaska was a great career move for him, and my mother was a nutritionist. She found increasingly challenging and significant work during her years in Juneau. Neither of them were particularly playful people, though both followed their dreams pretty aggressively. my father to build and sail a ketch in the waters of Southeast Alaska and Puget Sound, and my mom to travel extensively. That difference may have played a big part in their divorce when I was 30. I recall that conversations with them were best when I talked about serious things. They really weren't all that interested in how my brother and I dreamed, played, created, and imagined our world. My father often made it clear that his bottom line about children was whether they were well behaved, not whether they were fun or creative or imaginative. My parents didn't really discourage us, though. They merely left that up to us independently, and I value that. My father asked me late in life if his memory of not knowing much about what we were up to was true, and I assured him that he was correct. I said, "Dad, you didn't have a clue what we were up to." My mother's memory was that she really didn't know what to do with us until we were well into our teenage years. Mom was not a playful person. Earliest creativity and imagining that I can remember relates to music, not surprisingly. I started to play the piano just before my 7th birthday, and I immediately found it a place to play, to create, to improvise. My musical imagination didn't inform any future planning, though. It was all about being in the moment. I never dreamed about being a professional or performing for large groups of people. Probably one of the reasons performing professionally was not a driving force for me, but music opened up the world for me. I began early to think of ways that it would propel me to other places and to meet other people who were like me, although I certainly didn't express it in those terms. It took me eventually to 3 years of summer music camp, and with other musicians, I found a community that understood me and that I could literally play with. So that the creativity and imagination involved in music making created a core mode of being and connecting with others. I often observed that neither of my parents were very creative with language. They didn't tell jokes. Really, no dad jokes from Maury Pelto. They were fairly serious, the results of Finnish Lutheran practicality and industry on my dad's part, and Depression-era worry on my mom's. Somehow, though, I gained a real love for puns, although I'm not very good at them, and especially irony. I learned to say things like, "Too bad the weather sucks," when the sun was out for a picnic. Many times my mother's response would show that she took me literally and didn't understand my comment. One time in my early teens, we had a movie camera, and I got hold of it when no one was around. We were staying at a cabin on an inlet that had a dock, and I filmed a pair of sneakers stepping on their own off the dock, 1 second of frame per footstep, followed by a rock splashing in the water off the end of the dock. I thought it was funny and really cool. My dad found it as he was looking through the films from the summer. He kind of indicated to us that he would just edit it out of any final cut. I don't mean to make out that they were dour or stern. They were fun to be with, but I figured out that my world was just different from theirs. A bit of early family code switching, I guess. One of the other things my brother and I enjoyed doing, not many times, but very vividly memorable, was building plastic model ships, model battleships, and then going out into the woods and then running glue along them, setting the glue afire, burning to an eventual explosion of a firecracker. I don't see any way that kind of mayhem has informed my adult life. I'm more about building things up, but I still enjoy the guilty pleasure of movies with good explosions. It's pretty clear that geography had a lot to do with how I played, dreamed, and imagined. So far in my life now, I look back, I've lived in 9 states. I've visited 49 of the 50 states, not Mississippi, plus Puerto Rico and much of the world. Moving to Alaska itself is a great influence on me, and maybe the most powerful from my childhood, the thing that influenced my creativity and imagination. I, in fact, honor the imagination that my parents had to venture there in the first place. While that great place might seem isolated or isolating, for our family, and especially for me, it opened us to limitless possibilities. The 300-mile distances of Seattle, Pullman, and Corvallis of my first years became 1,000 miles. A journey up through British Columbia, across a bit of open ocean, past new towns with names like Ketchikan, Angoon, Wrangell, Metlakatla. Visiting relatives now entailed a 2-hour flight on Pacific Northern Airlines. Ferries and seaplanes took us to Sitka and Petersburg. I was in the pep band, not the basketball team, but school trips took us to music festivals and basketball tournaments. And those school trips involved 24-hour, sometimes 36-hour trips on the Alaska ferry system. The ships had cool local names like Malaspina, Taku, Matanuska. And we were met at the dock of those other towns by students who'd organized carpools and housing for the hundreds of us arriving. I have vivid childhood memories of hearing and watching float planes fly out of Juneau and ships sail out of the harbor. Invariably, when I was a kid, I thought about where they were headed and what was awaiting them. And that's still true for me. Watching airplanes take off and land, ships sail and dock, trains move through a crossing, I always think about the journeys and the destinations enjoyed by their passengers. And I'll sum up with this, talking about my childhood imagination. One way to sum this up: I think my childhood imagination was filled with words, music, and the possibilities offered by wild open spaces and far off places merely a plane or boat ride away. Our surroundings there in Alaska made me believe that anything was possible and that community was vital for the good of everyone. Thanks.
I just want to assure Bill that maybe we had more in common, even though my background was very different from yours. You grew up in these wide open spaces, and I grew up in Buffalo, New York, in a town that had maybe 10 feet between each house. But at the same time, I remember one time we were playing at my friend Tom Roberto's house, and we had built a Spanish galleon in his attic model, and then poured alcohol on it and lit it on fire inside of Tom's house. We then opened the window and threw the galleon out and saw that Tom's dad was coming home from work and just barely dodged being hit by the galleon. I did not see Tom for a month after that. No matter where young boys live, they always want to blow stuff up. This morning, I'm reading from a self-published zine I wrote in 2018 and revised in 2022, titled My Back Pages, and a little tip of the hat to Bob Dylan. This zine is about my lifelong love of comic books, which is something that very much ignited my imagination. The first story is about how I discovered comics as a child, and the second illustrates how comics continued and continue to shape my perceptions as an adult. 1963. When I was a baby, my family first rented a cabin on Friends Lake for 2 weeks in late July and early August. Friends Lake is small, 3 miles long, less than a half-mile wide at its narrowest, located 60 miles by car from Lake Placid in the Adirondack Mountains of New York State. Trips to Friends Lake became our family vacations for the next 3 decades. Almost every day during our vacations, my father would drive into Chestertown to buy groceries, and I would ride with him. One day in August 1968, Dad and I also stopped at a drugstore to pick up medicine and, quote, some celebrity magazines for your mother, close quote. And the drugstore had a newsstand stuffed with newspapers, magazines, paperback books, coloring books, and comic books. We could go to that next slide on there. Thank you, Preston. Dad told me to pick something out, and I chose a Stan Lee and Jack Kirby Marvel comic, Fantastic Four, number 80. This comic isn't the finest Lee Kirby collaboration. Tomazuma, the villain, is a goofy-looking totem pole monster. You can see that on the cover. And the story is marred by stereotypes about quote-unquote American Indians. But I loved Kirby's kinetic art, especially the opening splash page, featuring an extreme close-up on one of the characters in the comics, the Thing's craggy orange feet. Because I was just learning to read, elements of Fantastic Four number 80 were initially inscrutable to me. I could not understand the ads in that comic, but I read it over and over again during that vacation, cracking its secret codes. Over the next 19 years, I didn't miss a single Friends Lake trip, even after I moved out of my parents' house in Buffalo and relocated in Illinois for graduate school. Next slide, please. This is me in 1971, reading comics with my friends at the lake. I am wearing a bathing suit, even though it's not evident in the photograph. My dad and I kept driving into Chestertown for groceries, and he kept buying me comic books. though maybe I should have been embarrassed to accept money and comics from him in my 20s. I also found science fiction magazines and books at that Chestertown drugstore, including a mass market paperback of Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, a book I read years before I could begin to understand its sexual themes and politics. Although that drugstore is closed now, that newsstand meant everything to me, and I'm grateful that I grew up in an exploding, unruly print culture. Next slide. In a strange coincidence, I recently discovered that Otto Binder lived on Friends Lake during the early years of my family vacations. Binder was a prolific, influential comic book writer for Fawcett and DC Comics. He co-created both Mary Marvel, Shazam's teen sister, and Supergirl, and his prose science fiction also had an impact on comics. His stories about the heroic robot Adam Link, published under the name Yando Binder, a pseudonym he shared with his brother Earl, were adapted into comics in the 1950s and in the 1960s. As Bill Shelley writes in an article about Binder in Comic Book Creator number 13, Otto and his wife Ione moved to a modest home on Friends Lake Road in February 1969 after their only child, Mary, named after Mary Marvel, had been hit by a car and killed outside of her Englewood, New Jersey high school. Shelley quotes Roy Thomas, comic book writer Roy Thomas, on Binder's decision to quit comics and move to the Adirondacks. Quote, Binder told me that he didn't have the enthusiasm for comics writing anymore. He hinted that with his daughter's death, it was a little too painful and he would just as soon forget about comics, close quote. The Binder house was less than a half mile from our cabin, but I'm relieved that I didn't know then about his career and proximity. Luckily, I didn't intrude on the family's grief. Still, I'm unsettled that Otto Binder ate at the same Chestertown restaurants and shopped at the same Chestertown supermarket as I did, until 1974, when Binder died at the age of 63. How did Binder feel when he saw those comic books and science fiction magazines at the drugstore newsstand, dispatches from a dream world he helped to create? Next slide. Thanks, Preston. 1992. I was dawdling my way through a PhD program in English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I had trouble focusing on my work because back in Buffalo, my mother was dying of cancer. She was first diagnosed with breast cancer in 1985, while I was still living at home, but poised to start graduate school at Illinois in the fall. When my parents told me about the cancer, I said that I wouldn't go to graduate school, that I would stay home and care for Mom. No thanks, they said. They were insistent that I begin my adult life, and they realized that my willingness to remain in Buffalo was based as much on my fear of an unknown direction for my life as it was in some sort of noble self-sacrifice. I'm glad they exiled me from home. While I studied and partied in Illinois, my mom underwent several bouts of radiation and chemotherapy. I went home when I could, which wasn't often because I didn't own a car and couldn't afford the time and money that the one-way 16-hour bus ride from Champaign to Buffalo required. By 1990, though, I'd started dating Kathy, the woman I'd eventually marry, who graciously loaned me her car, a hand-me-down from her own parents, and I'd speed down I-90 and visit Mom and Dad more frequently. Every time I went home, Mom looked frailer and more diminished. She was collapsing in on herself. In December 1992, I charged an airplane ticket, flew from Chicago to Buffalo, and stayed with my parents for the Christmas holidays. A few weeks earlier, Mom had lost the use of her left arm. The nerves in her arm had been decimated by repeated radiation treatments and, according to her doctors, would never recover. My mom cried every time she couldn't do a task with her single functioning arm, weeping when she couldn't make a cup of coffee or fish keys out of her purse. On Christmas Eve, we exchanged presents. I bought my parents a microwave, thinking that it would make it easier for my mom to cook one-armed, and she was ecstatic. Then Mom and Dad gave me my gift, the deluxe poly-bagged version of Superman number 75, the infamous Death of Superman issue, packaged with a cheap black armband decorated with a blood-dripping S insignia. Of course, my parents knew that I read comics, though they didn't realize that by 1992, my taste had migrated to 8-Ball, Hate, and other black and white underground comics, and they heard the publicity about Superman's death. On the day the comic came out, my dad drove my sick, frail mom, who never had a driver's license, to a local shop where she stood in line for 2 hours to buy a copy. After the holidays, I flew back to Illinois and then returned to Buffalo once more before Mom's death in April 1993. The funeral ended with my father, my brother, and I following Mom's casket out of the church. When I began to weep, Dad turned to me and whispered, "Stop it, you're going to make me cry." I still have that copy of Superman 75. It's a terrible comic book, but I'll keep it forever. Occasionally, I remember the finale of the story, a double-page image of Lois Lane holding the dying Superman in her arms, a pop culture pieta, and I shake my head and wish I'd worn the tacky Superman armband to Mom's funeral. Thank you.
Okay, well, we packed it full between that and technology. We haven't quite left ourselves very much time for discussion, but we can have maybe a couple comments or questions. Any chance that Zoom is working? Can people talk on Zoom now? We'll start with the Zoomers, to be fair, so if Preston was able to get it.
Testing,
so, Sophie, you want to
testing.
try?
Can you hear me?
No, we still can't hear you. Yeah, have you guys put anything in the chat? Yeah, it looks like there's some comments in the chat. Preston, can you review those and see if there's things?
Thanks.
Okay, so can you hear us at all?
Yep. Yep.
Oh,
Hear you fine.
now I can hear you guys.
Oh,
I don't know what got fixed, but go ahead, Manny. Did you have something you wanted to say?
just thank you. Really, it was very, I'm blown out of the water each time. You guys are all great. Looking forward to maybe come and seeing you all live. Take care.
Okay. Sophie, do you want to try again? I don't know what got fixed, but now we can hear y'all.
I didn't really have anything to say. I was trying to let you know that we could hear Manny and you couldn't.
Okay. Yeah, I think it was a local issue here. We've had a couple different groups using the service, the building yet lately, and I think that they might have changed some settings. Michelle, please go ahead.
Hey, I just wanted to chime in and let you guys know that I grew up in my formative years in Ankara, Turkey. My dad was in the Air Force.
Wow.
And between the ages of 10 and 13, I lived in a predominantly Muslim country. So it was a fascinating boost to childhood imagination to actually see a different culture and to be immersed in that culture. And I was so lucky that my dad was an immersion kind of person. So he really got us involved in local culture, local language, local food, you know, sightseeing, just everything. And it was the richest portion of my life that I think fueled my imagination as an adult forever.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Michelle. Victor.
I had a story I could tell, but I think we're out of time. I was going to reflect on the idea of how imagination is so important to children, and that unfortunately often we get to a certain age when we're embarrassed by our imagination. So that might be something to discuss at a future point. I remember a particular incident when I was probably about in 6th grade, when my sister and I were playing, and we got embarrassed that we were playing the way we were, you know, which we thought we were too old to play that way. So it's kind of sad when we lose that joy of the imagination. We need to keep it, obviously.
Thank you. I think that's a really important point, and thanks for making sure that was included. Anybody else on Zoom? How about here in the sanctuary? Anybody have a comment they want to make?
Yeah, I'm Peyton. I would just say thanks for you all for sharing. Very emotional for just even to listen to you guys. But 2 things. We had a dinky bill growing up, which reminds me very much of the story you were telling. It was in a neighbor's home. Interestingly, we would spend a lot of time making roads, and it was kind of matchbox car driven. But again, every time it stormed, we'd start over. So our imagination got a reboot sort of very regularly. The other thing is, slightly to the point I think Victor made, is as parents, we need to remember some things that sort of seem weird or seem off or something. Samantha right now is learning about Therian, which I haven't really understood. It's the idea that your animalistic tendencies maybe come from somewhere else. I don't know where she learned about it, but I'm learning about it. But again, as parents, to be patient as they use their imagination, even if it seems weird.
Hi, I'm Ree. I've really enjoyed your stories. They really made my imagination come out. Your story about riding stick horses, oh, my brother and I did that. And we were riding to his farm. And on that farm, he would tell me that he had all of these animals, the horses and the goats and all this. And I really wanted it to be so. And I couldn't wait to get there. We were 4 and 8 at the time. I'm the oldest. And I just knew that he had a real farm somewhere. It was so wonderful.
Yeah, that's an element that kind of emerged for me as I was thinking about this service and delving into Vivian Paley a little bit and reading the book again, is this idea of imagination in community. And actually, that's a really wonderful segue to our closing hymn. So I'm going to go cut it short, because I'm sure we all could talk and maybe continue the conversation after that, but I'll do our closing words. And let me do the closing words, and then just want to do a plug for next week's. We have 2 services on Christmas Eve, important day. So want to give a plug for that. But our closing words and our closing hymn are "We'll Build the Land." So let's sing "We'll Build the Land." We'll do the closing words, talk about next week's service, and then extinguish the chalice. That's the plan, sticking to it. So please join in as you are able in singing hymn number 121, "We'll Build the Land." Let us sing the magic of imagination by which we know one another and learn the lives of eras gone by. Let us sing the magic of creation by which we build the world of our soul and teach its wisdom to others, young and old. Let us sing the magic of our lives together, holding and shaping by the movement of breath from heart to lung, all new life that is to come. Go now with singing, go now with magic in your fingertips, touch this world with life. And those words are by Susan L. Van Dresser. Next Sunday, Peyton, if you could just share the slide. Next Sunday is Christmas Eve, and we have, keep going. We have two services. We'll have a Sunday morning service that, Preston is here. Peyton will be our service leader next week. And it'll be about coping for Christmas. And then on Christmas Eve at 5:30, the time in the order of service is wrong. At 5:30, come here. We'll be sharing cookies next door, and then we'll have kind of a karaoke style Christmas carol sing along. And that service is coordinated by Katie Warner and Carl Moore. And Carl's taking requests for what songs will be in the Christmas karaoke. So his email is there. Now let's extinguish the chalice. You can stop sharing. Thank you, Linda. Keep the Chalice Flame Burning by Adam Slate. Be kind, be brave, be just, be merciful, be hopeful. This is how we keep the chalice flame burning until we are together again to light it anew. The service is concluded. Go in peace.